Well, I do want to thank everybody for signing up for our second event of the 2021 calendar year. We are Friends of Euclid Creek, and we're celebrating our 20th year of stewardship. So thank you all very much for joining. Before we get into Stephen's presentation, I want to encourage all of you to sign up for our upcoming events. We have 3 to speak of right now. On March 2nd, we have a trivia night. This is the first ever Friends of Euclid trivia night that will be done over Zoom. Everybody is going to be needing to be on the honors system, so no looking up answers or anything like that. We'll have some prizes to give away. We'll have a couple beverages and some laughs, hopefully. This event is open to members and those on our mailing list. However, we would prefer it if you were members. And if you would like to become a member of Friends of Euclid Creek, you can visit friendsofeuclidcreek.com. On April 27th, we have Dr. Roy Larrick, who will be showcasing a number of apps that can improve the home as well as the watershed. So he'll take us through a little walk there. And then on May 8th, we'll be partnering with Keep Euclid Beautiful, and we'll be doing some drain painting out throughout the city of Euclid. And that's always a fun time and a great project to bring some awareness to those that may not know where those drains go. So before we begin Stephen's presentation, just some housekeeping. So you know this program is going to be recorded. I'll get it up on our website in a few days. There'll be a link there, and then it'll be on our YouTube channel as well. Please use the chat. I know there's only about 20 of you right now, but still it just makes for a more seamless Q&A. So any questions you have for Stephen, please just enter them in the chat, and then we will get to them at the end of the presentation. And if you can do your best to stay muted, that would be helpful, so it'll minimize the distractions. So Stephen joined the foundation in 2014 as part of the community responsive grant-making team. In this capacity, Stephen also managed the foundation's summer internship program and oversaw implementation of the Cleveland Foundation Public Service Fellowship. In 2018, Stephen became the foundation's Environment Program Officer, overseeing development of an environmental grant-making strategy, including efforts to protect the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the parks and green spaces we enjoy by supporting policies and practices that link environmental protection, climate action, health, equity, and economic prosperity. Prior to joining the Cleveland Foundation in 2014, Stephen worked for the Cuyahoga Land Bank, researching and compiling property data for vacant property reuse opportunities as part of the President's Special Projects team. Additionally, he served as an AmeriCorps Vista with Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, focusing on neighborhood stabilization and urban agriculture projects. And Stephen founded a volunteer beach cleanup and advocacy effort directed at improving Euclid Beach Park. Previously, he served on the board of directors of the Cleveland Lakefront Conservancy, the Northeast Shores Development Corporation, and maybe the most important, he served on the board of Friends of Euclid Creek a while back. So with that, I would like to introduce Stephen Love.
Great, thanks, Steve. And thank you everyone for the opportunity to have a conversation tonight, and the FOEC team. And thank you everyone for joining in. It's really great to have this conversation, and certainly Friends of Euclid Creek holds a special place in my heart, as Steve mentioned. They are an organization I know well and serve not only on the board, but also as a volunteer water monitor for. So it's a great opportunity to have this conversation and talk really hopefully tonight about the work that the Cleveland Foundation is engaged in with environmental initiatives, but also how we got there, and then bounce back a little bit to even some of our history and who we are and how that factors into what we do today. And then, as Steve mentioned, I think we'll have some time, for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So hopefully just get your questions in the chat when they come to you, and then we'll do our best to try to answer those questions after the conversation. So with that, we'll get started. So the background of the Cleveland Foundation. Some of you might know this, some of you might not. You might know that in 2014, there were a lot of celebrations and events brought to you by the Cleveland Foundation. Well, that's because we were established in 1914. And to take you back to Cleveland 100 years ago or 107 years ago, it was a very different place. You know, you had massive immigration, you had industrial growth, you had pollution, and you had a lot of other externalities or inequities as a result. You also had, you know, out of the Gilded era, you know, major philanthropy in the form of our Carnegies or our Rockefellers who were, you know, putting their dollars into giant initiatives and projects across the country. But how could people who perhaps didn't have those means but wanted to give back to their community do so? Well, you had Frederick Goff, who was the president of the Cleveland Trust Bank, came up with this notion or idea of creating an endowment for the future, a community endowment by which multiple individuals could come together and put their dollars together and invest for the future, a future that they might never see themselves, but invest in this notion of an endowment. And that's really the concept by which a community foundation was created. So Cleveland actually is the birthplace of the community foundation, or a place-based philanthropy, this notion that we can put our dollars together all for the betterment of this region. Today, there's over about 2,000 community foundations globally, and it's actually one of the fastest growing fields in philanthropy, particularly in developing countries and Latin America. So who are we today? Well, the mission of the Cleveland Foundation actually hasn't changed all that much in the past 107 years. It's really about building a pathway to improve the quality of life for residents of this region, and working with our donors to do so and support that community endowment. What that translates into today, that endowment that started in 1914, is an asset base of $2.6 billion and the ability to put annual grant making out into the community to the tune of about $114 million. And today we're about, from a staff of one of Frederick Goff in the back of the Cleveland Trust Bank to a staff of 90. So we're a large organization, and I would be joining you from my office, but I'm joining you from home today. So how we approach our grant making, we think about it really in 6 integrated ways. We think about our grant making across education. We think about it across neighborhood revitalization and development, youth development, health and social services, arts and culture, economic development, and most recently, the 6th area of our focus has been the environment, which was really identified in 2020 as a core program area for the foundation. However, really the environmental grant making dates back a lot further than that, and I would argue is actually, you know, kind of part of the DNA of who we are at the Cleveland Foundation. We could think about really as far back as 1917, when Frederick Goff helped to create the enabling legislation that ultimately created the Cleveland Metro Parks. The first, this was the first political subdivision metro park district in the country, and certainly also started a whole movement that resulted in the creation of metro parks across the state of Ohio. And the Cleveland Foundation was pivotal to that, and we certainly know today how beneficial and critical these parks are to our well-being and daily life. Transform ourselves a little bit further down the timeline to the 1970s, to the creation of the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. The Cleveland Foundation was critical in working with partners like the Trust for Public Land to work on land assembly in the valley, and frankly create one of the most critical national parks in the country that really acts as an urban growth boundary in our region, and provides, just like the metro parks, that critical natural resource for all to enjoy. And this is my only cameo, I think, in the presentation photos. So if you can spot me, let me know. Fast forward a little bit more to the 2000s, and under the leadership of our current president CEO Ron Richard, there was a concerted effort or focus to also expand not only our environmental work from a land conservation and preservation standpoint, but also to think about how we expand clean and renewable energy in this region, and specifically, how do we build a robust sector for offshore wind. And so one of those projects has come to be known as Project Icebreaker, which is a pilot project to install up to 6 turbines about 8 to 10 miles offshore, and really position Cleveland and this region in the Great Lakes as one of the centers of offshore wind development in the United States, just like we're seeing it taking off on the East Coast. That project is still certainly very much underway, but I think speaks to kind of some of the long-term projects and commitments in this space that the Cleveland Foundation has been engaged in. We also, at our centennial, made major investments in public realm, public space in the core city of Cleveland through the renovation of Public Square, as well as the completion of the Centennial Lake Link Trail, which actually connects the towpath trail, which is another 30-year project connecting kind of a central spine down to the Cuyahoga Valley, but ultimately creates a link that takes you to Lake Erie and also takes you by one of the oldest public housing complexes in the country, Lakeview Terrace, and really providing access to the lakefront for those folks in the community who've historically not had that access. So this certainly speaks to the fact that there's been some through lines in our work. But at the same time, really up until recently, we haven't had a very focused environmental grant making strategy with a certain core set of goals. So my hope today is to help sort of convey to you tonight where that strategy originated from, what guides it, and then what are those core areas that we're invested in. So I think the first question we asked ourselves internally was, why should a community foundation care about environmental issues? We care about a lot of issues, as you saw, and we support a lot of grant making across, $100+ million a year. But why are environmental issues something that we as a place-based organization should be thinking about? Well, I think it's relatively easy, and I want to hopefully convey what guides our thinking around that. So one of them is quality of life. Where you live matters. Dr. Robert Bullard is the founder of the environmental justice movement, and he defines environment as the places where we live, work, play, and pray. It's all that surrounds us in community. And unfortunately, for those of us in, particularly low income or, communities of color, Black and brown communities, where you live absolutely translates into health disparities and perhaps just lower quality of life outcomes. We know Cleveland, ranks as one of the 9th most polluted cities in the nation for particulate pollution. Unfortunately, we also know that youth growing up in the Broadway and Clark Fulton neighborhoods, have 3 or 4 times more likelihood of having chronic asthma, than children living in Seven Hills or children living in Parma. So we know that these disparities are real, and these disparities are really grounded in the realities of, where you live. And so part of this work is about investing in really making changes that result in reducing those disparities. And part of that also, I think, is a recognition that, those disparities are really rooted in, unfortunately, the racial inequities and racial, structures that have unfortunately created the development patterns we have today. So this is long-term work, but we have to root our work in this understanding of how we approach our investment. We also know that healthy places, when places are healthy, we know that people are healthy. The World Health Organization really defines health in a broader spectrum than just healthcare. It really defines it as well-being. And so how do we invest? How do we think about places and spaces as a way to really drive that well-being? Well, we know that parks and green spaces, research has shown, they actually improve not only economic and property outcomes, but they also improve, physical and health well-being for people who live proximate to them. So from our perspective, there's no better way to think about kind of physical investment in the public realm as a key opportunity to really address or alleviate some of those disparities that, unfortunately plague so much of our community today if we invest in those, high quality parks and green spaces. We know that climate change is here. We know that the impacts are local, and they're being felt today. You see the 2018 National Climate Assessment, puts the Great Lakes in the Midwest as experiencing, erratic weather events, heavier rainfall, droughts in the summer, more severe winter. So unfortunately, it's more extremes. Take, for example, the extreme flooding we had here in University Circle in 2019. But we know that the solutions to address some of those climate impacts can also be at the local level and adaptable. Take for example, the major green infrastructure projects that were completed on Fleet Avenue in Slavic Village that really manage, not only current stormwater flows, but also, projected stormwater flows as a result of some of the heavier rain events, we're anticipating as a result of climate change in this region. We're also on the front steps of the world's great freshwater resource, the Great Lakes and Lake Erie. But we know that this particular asset also is currently facing some of the greatest challenges. Lake Erie, it's certainly the shallowest, but that also positions it to be the most vulnerable to environmental threats. Whether those threats are algal blooms from agricultural pollution and runoff, or invasive species, or plastic, or climate change, frankly, exacerbating all of those threats at the same time. Climate and those impacts are going to continue to be an issue. And if we don't address them, we have the potential to lose our greatest freshwater resource and not get it back. The EPA really determined that Lake Erie, out of all the 5 Great Lakes, was the only Great Lake that's really moving in a backwards direction in terms of critical health. So we need to really work together as a region and push forward a freshwater future that protects this great asset, not only an economic asset, but an environmental asset and an asset for everyone in our community. We also know that when we do work collectively and when we do work to invest in addressing, those environmental disparities or those environmental challenges, it has economic impact. I think we have to divorce ourselves from the dichotomy or the thinking that when we don't invest in the environment, or when we do invest in the environment, we're doing it at the expense of economic growth or jobs. No, we're actually thinking about this in the context of how do we invest in these issues and also spur economic growth and development. Take, for example, that Ohio is a leader in the clean energy sector. Well, that wouldn't probably be the case if back, over a decade ago, we passed legislation in Ohio that required a certain amount of power produced in Ohio to come from renewable energy. That helped to create an industry that today, puts us really as a leader in the Midwest. And think about that, that wouldn't attract students like, Prince here on the right, who's, a graduate of CASE and is now working on reduced friction technology for wind turbines, which has the potential to then be a new scaled industry in this region. So when we do invest in this work, just like with the Cuyahoga River fire, when we invest in cleaning up, we actually create economic growth and opportunity out of that. So how are we thinking about then our work going forward as a set of environmental priorities? Well, I want to spend probably more time than I would on some of our other priority areas, given our audience tonight, and take a little bit of a deep dive, no pun intended, on one of our first priority areas, which is protecting our fresh water. It's clear, as I mentioned before, that we face a number of threats, not only from our ecosystem, but certainly from the development challenges that come with it, not only to Lake Erie, but our surrounding watersheds. So what are we doing here at the Cleveland Foundation? Well, part of that is really building greater awareness to the connections we have to Lake Erie. And for most people in our community, the connection actually starts at the faucet. So how do we think about really building out more opportunities to address some of the inequities folks face when it comes to water affordability or aging infrastructure or flooding? Those are challenges that we need to address as a community. And certainly the Cleveland Foundation is working on that now in trying to provide pathways for more affordable water, supporting pathways to bring more dollars into our region for investment in infrastructure, and creating a pathway for more equitable water rate setting, for our sewer district, for our water department. It's also about building awareness to our waterways and our watersheds, which I like to think of if Lake Erie is the heart, that our watersheds are really the veins that feed it. And certainly, I'm preaching to the choir on this call, but we're really focused on helping to build and foster those connections, so folks do have that understanding with their waterways and their watersheds. We're working on piloting a citizen science program right now with the Cleveland Water Alliance and Cleveland Metro Parks that helps to bring more folks of color and students and other folks that might not be part of the kind of water monitoring community into that community, and using cutting edge technology to do it. We're also working to really explore how do we expand more access to our lake, to our riverfront, to our waterways, in ways that I think historically we've cut ourselves off from. So we're really excited to see opportunities to do that and build upon that access, and build that infrastructure that connects those access points to different amenities in our community. We also know that it's key to support collaborations, coalitions that improve water quality. We support the Lake Erie Watershed Collaborative, which certainly the Friends of Euclid Creek is part of that network, and we believe it's really critical to have opportunities that help bring multiple partners together to share resources and to scale impact. We also know that it's really critical to invest over time in building those coalitions, because we know that work takes time. And so we're committed to this work kind of in the long haul, in terms of building the infrastructure that it takes to improve water quality. We're also supporting water innovation and research. We know that in terms of this region, we already have over 300 plus water-based businesses. We have what folks nationally like to call a blue economy hub. But how do we really take that to the next level and foster even more incubation and innovation? So we're working with the Cleveland Water Alliance to help scale a lot of these innovative ideas and push them and incubate them into actual companies. And so, one of the great, really cool, exciting projects that we support is the Erie Hack Innovation Competition. And here you actually see Thomas Zung is pictured with one of the stormwater capture systems that he produced via 3D printer, but had modeled out already for engineering and production, and is now working on scaling, getting additional fundraising capital to implement these pilots. These are the types of projects that we would love to be able to support, but then we have to provide and have the ecosystem around them to actually scale them into profitable companies. So part of this is about building a network that supports an innovation ecosystem and supports economic development that's centered on this blue economy hub and fresh water for our region. We have a tremendous opportunity here. And then also, we know that art is a very powerful way to convey our connections to water. And hopefully some of you had an opportunity to experience some of the art that took place across the city, and particularly in the flats during 2019, which marked the 50th anniversary of the last time the Cuyahoga River caught fire. But this was one of our Creative Fusion program arts installations from Squid Soup, which was a London-based art studio working with local partners in the Superior Viaduct Bridge to create this installation. And we had roughly over 20,000 people experience or participate in that event back in the summer of 2019. And hopefully we'll get back to experiencing opportunities to gather together like we did before COVID in the same way. So beyond water, where else are we invested in this work and really prioritizing our thinking? Well, certainly, as I mentioned, climate change is here. The impacts are being felt. So from our perspective, we're working to reduce those impacts long term. And also in the immediate term, we need to create adaptations that hopefully make living with climate change and the impacts easier for everyone, and particularly for those who are going to be feeling the brunt of those impacts first and worse, whether that's low-income communities, the elderly, youth, or communities of color. So from our perspective, this comes in a number of different ways. We build awareness to take climate action. We're working with Youth Climate Action Network and the Alliance for Climate Education to really build a broader voice for youth in this region on climate and demanding action from our leadership on climate, both at the local and state level. We're working to support networks of partners and coalitions that ultimately push forward more proactive policy changes. And frankly, we're dealing with a very difficult political environment in Ohio when it comes to climate and clean energy. And so we hope to advance some policy solutions that even at a local level can make an impact. We're supporting a network, an initiative called Power Clean Future Ohio that supports cities to adopt 30% carbon emission reductions by 2030, and to do so in an equitable way that benefits everyone. And so we're working with those communities on that effort locally here. We're also then thinking about how do we leverage different forms of capital. We're not just a grant maker at the Cleveland Foundation. We actually have the ability to make loans, low interest, long-term loans. We call those our social impact investments. So we're exploring how we can deploy the social impact capital in a way that gets us to scale more solar energy deployment, deploy solar energy on landfill sites, former vacant lots, community solar, so that solar that actually pays you to benefit from it over time and generates wealth and income. So we're looking at this really in a holistic way of not only reducing emissions, creating policies that hopefully impact those that are going to be most impacted by climate change, and then also putting dollars out into this field today to really get more clean energy deployed. We also are working on enhancing access to high quality parks and green space. We know that, as I mentioned before, how critical parks are as civic infrastructure to our community, and certainly COVID-19 and the pandemic has just underscored how important those places and spaces are, for everyone's mental health, physical health, and just well-being as a place to go. So from our perspective, this is a key priority, and we're working closely with other partners like Cleveland Metro Parks and other stakeholders to really prioritize a platform for what does it look like to really scale up investment in parks, particularly ahead of our local elections at the mayoral and council level in Cleveland and county executive election in the following year. How do we really demand more constituencies that want to see more investment in parks and public spaces? And in direct projects, we've supported projects like the Euclid Beach Park Pier, which really helps to catalyze lakefront access and also allows for community members in low-income housing next door and seniors in low-income housing to access the pier in a way that they simply were not able to prior to this construction. And we're really excited about the work that's happening. As someone mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that's happening at the county level and in Euclid currently, to really explore how do we expand more public access, particularly on our waterways, and particularly in ways that open opportunities to really connect regional amenities to neighborhood and local assets in our community. We're also looking at enhancing equitable mobility. We know that as a state, we have really terrible funding for public transit and other modes of transportation. And so we're really looking at how do we build broader coalitions that support more investment into our public transit, into other modes of transportation, from bikes, pedestrians, scooters. We want to be able to support roadways and infrastructure that's for everyone, that thinks about our roadways as really safe spaces for everyone to access and utilize, regardless of what form of transportation they're using. So we're working closely with RTA and their new leadership. We work with Bike Cleveland, and we work with the city of Cleveland and the county to really try to prioritize those solutions. And also when it comes to some environmental work, we're looking at how do we build out the transition and support the transition to electric vehicles, but how do we do that in a way that prioritizes that transition, in city of Cleveland proper, in neighborhoods. And part of that is also looking at not just single occupancy electric vehicles, but also the electrification of public transit or of school buses, of places where we know that the impacts of that pollution are going to be, and the removal of it are going to be most acute and affected. And that's particularly in our low income communities and Black and brown communities here in this city. So we know that also this work requires building capacity in the field and also building a more representative movement, one that really reflects the movement in a way that those who are impacted by the environmental threats are also elevated as leaders in this work. So we continue to support, as I mentioned before, building coalitions and networks and strengthening those networks, but also then trying to support and elevating folks who are really moving the field forward, and recognizing that we can't have, an aging and relatively white environmental field if we're going to be successful in addressing some of these disparities that are really affecting folks on the ground. We have to build networks that are more representative. So we're working closely with folks who are doing that, such as the Black environmental leaders, and working with the Ohio Environmental Council and building their Cleveland office, and the Conservancy for Cuyahoga Valley National Park and their diversity, equity, inclusion work. So this remains and will continue to be foundational to our work going forward. And why now? What's the urgency to all of this work? Well, I hope I've conveyed the urgency, but certainly from our perspective, and I think Ron Richard, our president and CEO, probably sums it up best when he said at our annual meeting that, if we don't invest in addressing issues like climate change or environmental disparities or threats, that all of our other investments, those other program areas I talked about, stand to be in jeopardy. We were invested in a Say Yes to Education, a 30-year scholarship initiative for students in Cleveland public schools to go to college. Well, what's the world that we want those students to live in, and what's the community we want them to grow up in? If we don't address these environmental disparities, there's no future for us to invest in. So this is really about not only what we can do today, but really about shaping long-term investments and long-term work over time that's really going to translate into improving quality of life. And before I close up, I just want to mention, as we are in the process of building a new headquarters for the Cleveland Foundation in the Midtown and Huff neighborhood, that we really see the building as much more than just an office space. It's really a community center and a space that tries to speak to the aspirations of the organization and what it is we're trying to accomplish. From an environmental perspective, we'll be achieving hopefully LEED Gold, if not LEED Platinum building certification. We'll have solar energy production on site, management of stormwater, and certainly trying to achieve highly energy efficient design. But beyond that, it's really about creating a district scale development that helps to weave together neighborhoods in Midtown and Huff that have, for the most part, really been disinvested in for decades and have not really experienced the type of investment that places like downtown or near West Side or University Circle have, but ensuring that we're doing that in a way that is shaped with the community and not for. So we are really excited about 2022 when we'll be moving in, and I'm sure you and all of the rest of the community will be hearing more about this exciting project in the near future. So with that, I'm going to just say thank you so much to all of you for listening in. Thank you to Steve and to the Friends of Euclid Creek for the opportunity to share more about what we're up to at the Cleveland Foundation. And I'll turn it over or turn it back to Steve. And I think we still have some time for questions. I hope I didn't ramble on for too long.
No, you did not, Stephen. That was awesome. Very thorough, very inspiring, very exciting stuff. We have a few questions in the chat right now. So if anything comes to mind, maybe you got here late, feel free to throw them in there. So right now, here we go. So our first question, well, it starts with great presentation and thanks for being here. Much of the foundation's work resides in Cleveland. How do they organize and prioritize their outreach and funding in communities outside of Cleveland?
That's a great question. So technically, our footprint, the Cleveland Foundation footprint, actually encompasses all of the city of Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, Lake County, and Geauga County. So that's the Community Foundation's footprint. I would argue, though, however, the majority of our funding on an annual basis, that 114 million, the majority of it is invested in the core city of Cleveland. And I would say that really from our perspective, that's where we prioritize our investment. However, that's not to say that we don't support work, outside of the region or outside of the city of Cleveland boundaries. We have a number of instances where we fund work, at a county level, or we have Lake Geauga Fund that supports work out in Lake and Geauga counties. And certainly we also recognize that even though we're really hyper-focused on this region, there are times that we support efforts at a state level because we know that what touches this region is often the product of policy that's not made in this region, but it's made in Columbus or even made it in DC. So we understand that we have to work sometimes beyond those boundaries from a funding prioritization and support policy work or advocacy work that might take that dollar outside of this region. So I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The next question. All right. Do you have any guidance for organizations that would like to encourage participation in communities of color?
Yeah, I think the key question, this is a journey that we're all on, including the Cleveland Foundation. I think part of this is really the recognition that unless we have people of color within our organization or within our leadership or within staff, it's going to be really difficult to make those entry points and to build trust. And so part of this is really about building trust in the community and not coming. I think the environmental movement as a whole has a lot of history of kind of parachuting in or trying to address issues for community as opposed to really with community. So I think from our perspective, it's really about seeing where organizations are really trying to go deeper and building not only a more diverse team, but then kind of taking the next level of saying, we have to really build those deeper networks and relationships. I think one great organization example who's really leading the work has been the Conservancy for Cuyahoga Valley. Debbie Andala and her team, they've been doing some really great work when it comes to prioritizing this, not only from within the organization and frankly within the organization before they try to serve or work external to the organization. So it's a journey and it takes time. And I think talking to other folks in the field who are leading it is really a great first step.
Certainly. The next question is, I have read that the Haslams are interested in investing in the lakefront around Brown Stadium. Is the Cleveland Foundation involved in these discussions at all? Any details you could share? Thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you. At this point in time, I don't believe we're invested in that particular project. I know there's a lot of different initiatives underway. There's certainly, I think, some level of interest in private development in that location. There's also sort of larger planning studies taking place that include the Inner Harbor and Brown Stadium. But at this point in time, no, we're not directly engaged in that effort.
All right. Next question. It starts with good presentation. How does East Cleveland fit your environmental funding?
Yeah, East Cleveland is absolutely part of our footprint, and certainly, I think, an exemplary location that speaks to decades of essentially disinvestment and disparity that now translates into not only then the physical realm in terms of what that neighborhood looks like today, but also in terms of the health disparities that really unfortunately are representative, whether that's infant mortality, asthma, lead poisoning. So from our perspective, East Cleveland is absolutely part of our footprint from the standpoint of intervention and funding, and how we certainly hope to address some of those higher level disparities. And some of that's policy work. Some of that may be, opportunities to think about, direct, if there is a direct project or particular project, or it's, solutions that we're trying to scale as an entire region, like getting more solar installed across the region that, could certainly benefit residents in East Cleveland, or addressing issues like water affordability or infrastructure that could then immediately have a beneficial impact to households in East Cleveland. So, it's across the board, and certainly, part of where we're thinking about our work.
All right, awesome. Let's see, give everybody another couple seconds if there's any other questions, but I think that might be the last one. You might be off the hook, Stephen.